Right, so that was Europe Endless. Matt, why don't you run the numbers for us?
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
So in the 1970s, KRAFTWERK-TRANS, it's Europe Express or Europa?
It's Europe.
It's Europe. Yep.
Best ever album says Europa.
We'll talk about why there might be some confusion when I get into
John
it.
will have that. Okay. All right. So anyway, this record was number 71 on Best Ever Albums list in the 70s, ranked number 10 in 1977, number 284 of all time, and it did make Rolling Stone's list, coming in at number 238, which is very close to 284. So that's the Best Ever Albums, and Rolling Stone are kind of seeing a little eye to eye on this record.
Okay, and one of the reasons you might have heard a pause there between the end of the segment and now I was pulling up my notes and had my microphone muted because the notes I have this week are expansive, shall we say. So I
like a Trans-Europe
Express. Yes, exactly. I'm going to try to narrow them down into not taking up too much time, but also giving Kraftwerk the credit that they deserve. They are a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame band, and it seems like every week I get an album, I get one of these bands that are like highly influential, right? It seems like we've been on a run of these bands.
They're a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame band?
They are a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame band, my friend. So,
when did they get in?
I will have to check my notes at the end, but I think I want to. Oh God, you're gonna make. Why do you ask me these questions?
I always thought because I thought that they. I don't think they ever got in. I think that's one of the things that they always said that they should be in, but they never.
Now we have to
got
clean
nominated.
The damn stack. Now we have to clean the damn stack. So let's.
I'm gonna look.
I'm not trying to be difficult.
Just go ahead and look, so we're not getting angry Kraftwerk fans coming at us. I've got all this bio, and Matt's derailed it already for me. Jesus. So with something as benign as if they're in the rock, I shouldn't have even mentioned it. So. All right.
The 2021 they were inducted.
2020.
Really?
They're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. 2020.
So that's why you missed it. Perhaps.
That is also why I think it was on my mind because I was reading it. You know what I mean?
And that Hall of Fame induction ceremony comes out on the 30th of this month.
So that's why it just okay. We'll take forever Rock and Roll because I knew for years. That's why I said it because it's like one of those things that they've kind of been nominated once or twice, but never were even close to getting in. So I'm kind of surprised. So well, good. I'm glad to hear that. I'm sorry I interrupted, John. Continue, please.
No problem. So one thing that I'm going to apologize in advance is I did try to do my homework in terms of name pronunciations here. So it's not like I'm just going to butcher stuff. However, some of the names, even with name pronunciation, the combination of my New Jersey accent / my English, right, may not do the best justice to some of the names of the band. So I apologize to any native German speakers or fluent German speakers if I do not do justice in the way. I'll do the best I can. So Kraftwerk, Trans-Europe Express, the album that we're covering, released in 1977. Little bit about Kraftwerk. They were founded in Dusseldorf, Germany, in 1969 by Ralf Hutter, who was the organ and synthesizer player, along with Florian Schneider, who played the flutes, which by the time this album came along were long gone from Kraftwerk, as well as the synthesizers, which by the time this album came along were not long gone from this album, and the violin, which I did not catch much of on this either, but he did play the violin. They met at the Robert Schumann Hochschule School in Dusseldorf. As you can imagine, in terms of if you know anything about Kraftwerk, and maybe some of you do not, but they are considered to be one of the innovators of electronic music and a founding father of what we've been calling krautrock or German rock. They were a little bit more vocal about the fact that they didn't love the krautrock term, but not because it was a negative or pejorative term, right? It was more they thought it was given to them by the English, and when we say English, we're talking England press. And part of what the idea behind that German rock sound was to create sort of a new German music divorced from other Western music, right? So it was kind of looked at, negatively on multiple fronts.
So they didn't want to be classified as rock, basically?
So I could go into well, I could go into all right. So let me break off for a quick second. One of the things to know about this German rock sound is that there were these protests in the late 1960s in Germany. And any German, listeners who have a better idea in European history, folks, and I know Matt said, boy, you guys did a lot of European history last week. So Matt, get ready because there's going to be a little bit more here. Yeah. So there were a lot of protests in the late 60s in Germany, student protests, much like in the United States, right? And in terms of what was going on. And a lot of them were about the clash, and actually kind of similar to what we talked about way back in the day, guys, in Brazil and stuff, between the traditional elements of society and the new young post-World War II element of society, right? And once again, a lot of what we talked about before. Germany lost a lot of folks, right, in the aftermath of World War II, and also had to reconcile with, the lasting legacy of World War II. And so in the aftermath of it, there's a lot written about sort of a collective guilt in Germany and what the aftermath of German culture should look like. It's actually a kind of a part of the DNA of Germany even to this day, right, in terms of some of the rules and sort of the laws in terms of tolerance and stuff that are built around it. They take it a level above. But in the aftermath of these student protests, there were folks, and you remember this band was founded in 1969, so this is in the throes of that wanted to create a uniquely German music. And the reason was because they felt that German music was either very traditional German sort of nationalist music, right, which they did not feel had a positive connotation, or was like cheap knockoffs of like Western music, which they did not find to be particularly riveting, right? So the idea was what could constitute a new German music. And that is a lot of where the idea of what this krautrock came from. And, whether it be new or we corrected that, right? Because it's not new, right? We found out that it's neu, correct? Am I
correct?
Correct.
That's
so
correct.
neu, right? I once again think about people being infuriated by our review of that. So neu and Faust and Craftwork, they were part of this thing. KN as well, who were part of this idea of creating a new music. And as you can probably figure out, a lot of it is based around the idea of, I talked about it earlier too, not tying to R&B rhythms or even jazz rhythms, sort of a different type of music and sound. So found music to some degree. And how Craftwork fits in is they're part of this found music as well, but they are the ones that really push the music in the synthesizer electronic realm, and that is what they're known. So getting back to kind of the bio, Craftwork was originally part of the two members, Schneider and Hutter, were originally part of a quintet known as Organization with an S, and released an album in 1970. The band split shortly afterwards, and around the aftermath of this, Schneider becomes very interested in synthesizers and actually acquires one in 1970. While both men were visiting an exhibition in their hometown about visual arts, Gilbert and George was the name of the exhibition. They saw two men wearing suits and ties claiming to bring art into everyday life. This was, I guess, profound in terms of the vision of what Craftwork would become artistically. This is a band that eventually actually has a member of the band that sort of is like the equivalent of a stylist as well. They also, in sort of something that would be appropriated later by Daft Punk and people like, and even like Tool to some degree and stuff, they eventually just phased themselves out entirely as the iconography of the band to be replaced by like robot members. Gorillaz is another good example of that, right? Like, so they basically, by the time this album, Trans Europe Express, is here, they're sort of being represented as like robot folks. And actually, Craftwork is often called robot pop, especially their albums from 1974 to 1981. That is a run that includes Autobahn, Trans Europe Express, The Man Machine, and Computer World. That is their real robot pop period, in case you're trying to get there. So they're in the West German krautrock scene, and they're becoming more interested in synthesizers and drum machines, and something that will definitely be in this album and was in the album before this too, Vocoders, which is that voice code machine.
Yes.
Yes, which that's when you hear the lyrics on this album, right? It is translated through that vocoder. So that's kind of what you're hearing there. So Craftwork fluctuates members between 70 and 74 before Wolfgang Fleur comes in on percussion. in 1974. And remember that what percussion means in Kraftwerk is drum machine, right?
Yep.
And Karl Bartos in 1975, and they become a full quartet, and that is the vintage version of the lineup. That is also the version of the group, the 4 members, that's on this album. You may remember that in the time between 1970 and 1974, that the group had included Michael Rother and Klaus Dinger, who actually left the group to form Neu. And I think we talked about that in the Neu episode as well. The only person who was there the whole time during that period was Schneider, because Hutter left for 8 months to finish his university studies before returning. Their first 2 albums, Kraftwerk and Kraftwerk 2, were released in 1970 and 1972. They were definitely free-form experimental albums, so a lot more like some of the other German rock we've covered. They also include traditional instruments like the guitar, the bass, the drums, the organ, the violin, and the flute. And really the only idea of that sort of distorted electronic feel is there's some distortion in post-production and audio tape manipulation, the multiple dubs, kind of the stuff that like the Mothers of Invention were doing, who actually was a very big influence on Kraftwerk and krautrock in general. 1973 sees them release an album called Ralph und Florian, which I'm no German expert, but I'm going to guess is Ralph and Florian, right? Yes. Which marks their first step into heavy use of drum machines and synthesizers, and that's where the vocoder comes up as well. It's important to note that Kraftwerk says that their influences during this period for that, which is the beginning of the sound we're starting to hear, is actually the MC5 and the Stooges. Is who they consider to be. And it's as much, they described it as their adrenalized insurgency was something that influenced them. You have to remember that, Kraftwerk is highly stylized, right? So it's as much about the aesthetic as it is about, well, I shouldn't say as much about, but the aesthetic is big, is a good way to put it. Mm-hmm. We've talked about Connie Plank before, right? Both in other krautrock albums, and then there's a good thing when we do Neu where Jeff guests, right? My buddy Jeff guests, and he talks about Connie Plank in the bio about him. But Connie Plank's the guy who's the sound engineer and the producer of a lot of what are dubbed krautrock albums, and he is actually the guy who, in the early Kraftwerk albums, is the sound engineer and the producer. However, by the time Trans Europe Express comes, he's largely not a part of the equation anymore. So this part of Kraftwerk sort of represents a break from the Connie Plank era of krautrock albums. So as I mentioned before, this period from 74 to 81, where Trans Europe Express is pretty much right in the middle of it, is their robot pop period. They did Autobahn first, and the Autobahn is where they start using the Minimoog and the EMS Synthi AKS. It's the last album Plank produces and engineers. They add another member of the band as a fifth part. This is where they add Bartos for the synthesizer and the vocals through the vocoder. And Emil Schult is hired as a lyricist, artwork designer, and general artistic muse, is his description for the band. The band, then, it's very interesting how Kraftwerk begins to grow, because Autobahn is received well. And so as a result, they get a bunch of support from a group called Phonograph Incorporated in 1975. This allows them to tour the US, the UK, and Canada for the first time. So this is where they really break from being, a regional band to sort of a more national band, especially in artistic circles. Mm-hmm. This is also when the flute basically goes bye-bye, and the vibraphone is the instrument that Bartos replaces it with.
And they send the flute over to Jethro Tull? Is that what happened?
I think the flute was already with Jethro Tull, and they just carry the banner. I think that's how that works. You may be wondering, well, John, what is robot pop? Were you guys thinking that by any chance?
Yes, I was thinking that.
I thought of it as Kraftwerk.
There you go. So robot pop is electronic music with, and this will sound familiar, I think, electronic music with pop melodies, sparse arrangements, and repetitive rhythms played by folks in a stylized image of matching suits. So I describe it, the John description is, think the New Romantics, those groups, like Roxy Music, all the way to like, the ones in the early 80s, like Flock of Seagulls and stuff, those highly stylized bands, Duran Duran even, mixed with like Devo. That's kind of like the combination.
That was a very specific description up until like right up until the they have to wear matching suits. So if you do all the sounds but you're not wearing matching suits, are you ceasing to do robot pop?
I think that the image was a part of the robot pop because what they were doing was part of that larger idea of music as art, right?
Right.
Whereas, like, I don't know if they viewed the other stuff was just music or stuff. Like I said, you have to understand there's a cultural connection here for Kraftwerk to what in some ways it's tied to like what is West Germany and a larger existential idea, if that makes sense. So they're kind of creating it. So 75 sees a release called Radioactivity, which does not sell as well as Autobahn, but is particularly well regarded in Europe and significantly increases their fan base in Europe. This is also when Kraftwerk says, you know what, we're not going to do any more avant-garde, really, and we're going to like go more fully into this robot pop idea. Also during this time, David Bowie, who was a huge fan of them, asked them to tour with him on the Station to Station tour, an album we've covered, but they declined. However, Bowie does meet them in LA at one point, and we have not covered any of the Berlin trilogy yet, but of course that was heavily influenced by Kraftwerk at this time. The album was recorded in Germany in the Kling Klang studio before being mixed at the Record Plant Studios in LA. The release of the album was marked with a train journey in Europe, and as a matter of fact, the themes of this album were a celebration. It was described. This is how it was described in multiple things: a celebration of the titular European railway service and Europe as a whole. And one of the very interesting things about this album is that Kraftwerk had an idea that eventually they went from looking at what is West Germany to looking at what is Europe. And they wanted to reestablish Europe as a distinct concept, right? Divorced from other stuff. And a lot of what they imagined was instead of people being of a German heritage, they would have a more European identity. Now, what does that sound similar to?
I don't know. What?
Well, if you said the EU, that would be very similar.
I'm thinking of bands.
Yeah.
No. That's a lot of what the idea, a lot of what Kraftwerk's vision of Europe was what ultimately became the EU.
Got it.
In many ways. So it's kind of crazy.
To thank for the EU.
You got it. And a couple more notes here before we go into it. They're using, for folks that like to go into the deep details, they are using a Synthonorma sequencer, which is a customized 32-step, 16-channel analog sequencer. It'll also allow them to do more elaborate sequenced synthesizer lines, hence that sort of repetitive, metronomic sound. You hear it most in Franz Schubert and Endless Endless. And basically what it allowed is instead of a keyboard player having to like pound out those parts, synth takes care of it. Okay. Fleur leaves the group in 87, Bartos in 90, and Schneider in 08. All of the members of the classic lineup as of yesterday, when I did the finished research, are alive except for Schneider, who unfortunately died in 2020 at age 73. Another interesting fact is that Kraftwerk usually releases 2 versions of every album. A German version, which is released in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and an English version, which is released for everyone else. So there you go.
Okay.
And another part of the band, as I mentioned before, the band is notoriously reclusive and are considered to be very rare and enigmatic. They use life-size mannequins and robots to conduct their official photo shoots. They do not accept mail and do not allow visitors. There's some awesome stories about this. I'll give 2 that are fantastic, so I know you'll love this. One example of the eccentric behavior was Johnny Marr of the Smiths said that anyone trying to contact the band for collaboration would be told that they had to call the studio telephone, but it did not have a ringer while they were recording. So basically you would call this phone at a precise time, and Hunter would basically, it sounds like he would like guess that the call was coming and basically pick up the phone, and you would just hope that it's like when I imagine one of those like ransom calls, you know what I mean? But instead of like it going, you basically just pick up the phone with no ringer, and it's like it's 6:23, right? And this is what I'm going to call, but there's no ringer to say this person's calling. So Johnny Marr was describing being there while watching this happen. And Chris Martin of Coldplay said that he requested permission to use the melody from the track Computer Love on the song Talk, which is a single that you probably may recognize from the album X and Y. He sent a letter through the lawyers of the respective parties, which of course they don't accept mail, to somebody else. And several weeks later, he received an envelope that contained a handwritten reply that said simply yes. So I thought
is that contractually, official?
I just thought it was funny, and it was yes, by the way, in lowercase letters. So I thought that was funny too. So those are some examples. So there is a little. I tried not to go too long, but there was a lot right there. There is a little bit of.
Is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony induction going to be very anticlimactic since they don't want to?
Well, I don't know if they're even going to do it. You know what I mean?
So,
are they going to send the robots? Or?
I have a quick cleaning here. So they're getting inducted as an early influence award. They're getting an early influence. So they're not technically, they're not getting inducted as a performer in the traditional sense.
In fairness, how else could you induct Paul McCartney a few more times? So
well,
yeah. So that's a pretty good bio right there.
Yeah, definitely.
That's just very odd that you wouldn't pull the trigger. It's like, why would you even do that? But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's a sham anyway. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that being said, Josh, let's have you start this off. What were your thoughts on Trans Europe Express by Craftwork, which, by the way, the Europa could very much come from the German pronunciation. Yeah, so
and it's the differences in the album. Just they say the words in German. I imagine.
You got it.
Okay,
the rest is all the same.
So, got it. Robot pop is certainly a apt description of this album because it describes it completely and entirely and succinctly. This was an album overall that I respected, and I totally understand the influence that they have and to electronic music and to music as a whole, but I didn't love it. It's not one of those albums for me that I'm just gonna like put on and want to listen to on repeat, or have it certainly gets stuck in your head due to the repetition and the rhythmic nature of it, but it's not it's missing something for me in terms of lasting appeal. It's kind of, I don't want to say it's like doing your homework, but it's just kind of basic in a way, while also being groundbreaking at the time. I totally get that. What I hear, there's a lot of repeating rhythms. I feel like the album slowly builds on itself, and at times as you go through it, it's about 45 minutes long. Is that right? I think, 42 minutes. And you sort of like get into this almost like trance-like state listening to it at times, because the songs, the back half of the record almost like is like one long song, and there's no, if you didn't look while you were listening to it, it just kind of bleeds into the next song, and the like underlying rhythm and beat carry over as well. So there's really no differentiation from song to songs at certain point, other than elements that they add to it, or maybe different words that they're saying through the vocoder. Every like electronic band after this takes from them, right? Like Daft Punk, LCD Sound System, Chromatics, those all came to mind. And I think Kraftwerk is what people think of when they think of electronic music in some respects. It's completely synth based. Unlike the other krautrock bands that we've listened to, like Can, they draw on like so many different, they incorporate so many different other instruments and ideas and things like that, and Neu, and Kraftwerk is like all synth, all like drum machine. It's just like all electronic. And I think that's a differentiation from what we've heard to up to this point. It sounds, people could say like, dismissively that it's like video game music. It certainly sounds like that at some points, especially in Hall of Mirrors. It sounds like that at first. It has chanting in it as well. The the repetition of the phrases that they say gets stuck in your head. And in Trans Europe Express, I definitely knew that beat from a rap song before I even knew it was Kraftwerk. Yeah, yep. That was like, I know I've heard this somewhere before, and then I had to look it up. But going back to that robot sound too, like on Metal, which is kind of part of the suite of on the back half, it's got metal clanging sounds like in a factory. It's like you're a robot in a factory or something, and then they carry on that that theme and modality throughout the rest of the album. It is, I was into it at first. It kind of, with Endless, you kind of move to it, and it's very like danceable. But then as the album went on, it became a little droning and too, there wasn't enough there for me to, or there wasn't enough change throughout the songs. It's very like, not monochromatic, but
monotonous.
Monotonous. Yeah, that's a good word. And it was too long as a result, or it felt too monotonous, even when they added these elements to it. So I think it's an important album to listen to. I think everyone should probably listen to it once just to see where everything derives from. It's definitely foundational, and you can see the roots, and I can appreciate it from that respect, but I don't think that I would probably revisit this album.
Okay. Matt?
So I have some mixed thoughts. I think on one hand, this album is remarkable. And the production, it sounds great. It just, the synths on here are just so prominently and clearly up front, because really that's all that's going on for the most part. And it just it sounds really great, I think, and it starts right off. I love the beginning. Like, I think it's kind of got this upbeat, kind of happy tone to it with Europe Endless. Mm-hmm. And it's very, it's appealing in certain ways, because it's somewhat comforting, I would say, what they're doing with it. And it also just reminds me of, like, this sounds like 80s stuff. This sounds like the beginning of like what was coming on with a lot of 80s synth pop, and also what would come later on, like Josh, mentioned a couple bands. LCD Sound System is a big one that, and I'm drawing a lot of similarities between my thoughts on LCD Sound System and this album, at least. And so it's so, it's so forming the ground, the foundation for what's to come in the years, and you can absolutely hear that. The idea that, regardless of whether they belong in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as an artist or not, like the fact that they're having an influencer award is certainly well deserved, because this is like this probably just turned a lot of heads in 1977 and the years that they were doing this, because we've heard synthesizers before. Pete Townsend was delving into the synth a little bit with The Who. He wasn't doing anything close to this. This is a totally synthy album, and I like synth. I grew up on 80s synth pop. It was one of the genres that I first loved, and so there's something very appealing about this. On the other hand, this is also a very ridiculous album. like this is so, it's just, and I think it does get couched into that idea of, it does sound like a video game kind of thing, like overly robotic. Like, this is something that, you might see like in Tomorrowland at Disney World or whatever, like this really fake, kind of the idea of what the future is going to be like, as far as people thought that the future would be like in the 1980s, like that would be all these crazy things. And of course, nothing's come to fruition in that regard yet. But it does, when you hear these beeps and boops and stuff, it makes you laugh a little bit, and it's kind of ridiculous at the same time. It is absolutely monotonous and repetitive. Josh is absolutely right, and it's fine. It's also kind of one of the complaints I have about LCD Sound System, which kind of has good ideas, like the beginnings of songs I tend to like much more than by the end of the song. There's elements here that I'm going, oh, this is really cool. I like what they're doing. And then a couple of minutes later, I'm like, okay, it's not really going to do a whole lot, more after this. And then you're not done yet. It's not like it just stops at 4 minutes. It goes on to 9:40, and it's just like, all right, and there's a couple of things that they throw in here and there that give it some variety, but to me, it's not enough variety. I will say that I do like the song like Europe Endless and Franz Schubert and Showroom Dummies. I like those better. Like, they seemed a little bit less dystopian. That's the other thing I get. This seems like a soundtrack to like Squid Game or something like that. Like this dystopian, kind of thing. And like something like the Hall of Mirrors or Trans Europe Express is to me, it's very dark sounding. It's very menacing and very ominous. And it's a couple of times I'd be listening to this like walking down the street at night, walking my dog, and I'm like, with a dimly lit road, I'm like, this is not the best place and time to listen to this. It's a little spooky, if you will.
Yeah,
but
I wonder if they intended it to be kind of dystopian feeling.
It certainly sounds like it. I don't know how you can just be like, oh, look at that, look what we just did. It's like it almost has to be somewhat. But that's something like Showroom Dummies. I'm sure they're commenting on stuff about like human society, culture, consumerism, all that stuff. Showroom Dummies is like, we're dummies, and then we break out, and then we go dance, and we're like, not really. We're just doing what everybody else is doing, and we're soulless, and whatever. So yeah, it's not I wouldn't say this is a happy album, although there are kind of happy sounding moments to it. It is very it's I don't know, isolating, or it's just very dark, in a lot of places. So mad props to these guys for doing what they did when they did it, and how it just changed music as a long lasting record that I'm going to go back to over and over again. No freaking way. This is something that's good to know. It's good. It is a little bit of doing your homework in terms of music history, I think.
Yeah.
And there's some moments that I'm like, okay, this is cool. Maybe I would put this on as a song, but to sit here and listen to 45 minutes of this straight, it's a bit much. It's not really my thing, and I think droning and monotonous are good words to put to it. And I know that they're trying to be a little sparse. I think it would be served better if they tried to maybe build things on more, maybe added a couple of other instruments, made it a little bit more variety. I would probably like it more, but that's not what they were going for, so that would not make this Kraftwerk, at least the Kraftwerk that people have come to know and respect and love. So yeah, it's a little mixed. It's respecting the game and liking certain parts of it, but overall just falling flat, I think.
I love you guys, right? You're totally wrong on this. This album's fucking awesome. And also totally, like, I feel like I listened to a different album, because a lot of the things you guys were saying, outside of what the basic hallmarks of the album are, I feel like the total opposite of it. This album is remarkable for being sparse and also remarkably poppy, which is so hard to do. They have none of the bells and whistles that make a traditional pop album, like nothing in terms of melodies or the traditional framework and stuff. The whole melody is built off monotonous sounds and repetition that subtly builds upon itself, and variations of the theme. It's like the idea of the math rock that we talked about, but it's a different type of, it's a precision instead of a complicated math rock. All I could think of is this album for me was just the theme is obviously about about Europe and about industrial society. It sounds like a damn train. It's remarkable. It's called the Trans Europe Express, and the album literally sounds like a train, all the way down to the songs like being like the journey on the train. It's really remarkable how they crafted like a sonic soundscape that did that. As Matt mentioned, no one is doing synthesizers like this at any point in the 70s. The sound is so familiar because so many people took what Craftwork did and took
Right.
it in 1,000 different directions, from, like you guys mentioned, the absurd or the video game, but also it darkened it up and it became industrial, like Nine Inch Nails, right? Or, you know, souped it up and made it poppier with catchy lyrics and merged it to Western music, right? And that's how you get synth pop that Matt mentioned. You guys didn't even mention like bands like Joy Division and stuff, which is all over this, like a bleak sort of. I feel like an area where I must have listened to more of this than you guys did. Like, you guys will always leave out bands like Joy Division and like New Order and Depeche Mode. Like, I mean, my God, this is like where it came from, right? And those bands have that sort of make you uneasy, like industrial sound. I even see a little bit of like what Pink Floyd was doing in The Wall, right? That they would do later, right? You don't think the concept of like The Wall in terms of thematically was coming from some of the stuff like this? Like, it's hard for me to believe that there wasn't at least some, because the whole vibe of The Wall by Pink Floyd is kind of what this gives off along the way. I think that my takeaway is just it's incredibly influential. It's almost like listening to like, for me, it was a very enjoyable, almost like ASMR experience where like you just kind of like, it's like hypnotic, but in the way that like the hypnotic rhythms can really create like a feeling for you. And it just, every time I listen to this album, I listened to it a couple times, I really enjoyed it. It's like, it's a great late night album. It's a great driving album. It's just, there's all kinds of stuff that just appealed to this. Like I said before, the gift is, my God, to make pop songs coming from this standpoint without anything there, and to have the space they had, but still have a pop sensibility to it. I mean, to me, the other krautrock stuff was interesting, but this was by far the most appealing to me because it was the most divorced from what I knew, but also the most melodic in some ways, I feel like. And it's weird to say melodic with like a robot sound, but it is. And I think the only reason that you guys heard this as cliches is just because so many people have appropriated this and it's gone down so many roads that the familiar boxes out the revolutionary. For sure. And I thought, I was a little surprised that you guys didn't hear it as his revolutionary, because this might be the most influential album that we've listened to in the entire 70s so far in terms of what came the next 30 years, because this is doing something completely different without really any roots in it. And you know, and even some of the stuff that we've talked about that's influential, like there's you know, we talked like last week, we talked about like Big Star and the Jam being influential, right? But they're variations of a theme, right? Of stuff that came before. Whereas this, it's like, what's the variation for the theme here? Like, is it the monotony and technical stuff of like classic music, you know, classical music? It certainly is not rooted in a Western tradition. There really isn't an electronic music to do, like you mentioned, like Pete Townsend dabbled in the synths, but nothing like this. I mean, they were just like the condiment on it at the end. So like, this one's easily in my top 10 albums we've covered so far. I love this album, and unlike you guys, I absolutely and would actively seek out this album again, especially at certain periods, because it brought a feeling in me that was really rewarding as well. So
wow. Sounds
yeah,
like
I very much disagree with it's everybody gets their opinion. I'm not saying I'm right, but I don't know if I.
Well, you did say we were wrong.
Well, you know, I always say
you,
that, but
I must be right then.
In my mind, I'm right, but you know, nobody else is. But I don't know if I've disagreed as much on an album with you guys as this one, because it wasn't even just like I didn't like it, I liked it. Even some of the things that like you said about it were not things that I felt like, and it doesn't mean it's so interesting how music is perception and how you hear it, right? Because as you guys were talking, I was like, wow, not only do I not agree, it's like I feel the opposite about it on most things. So it's really interesting. So yeah.
What is ASMR? It's
like sounds that create like you know, it's kind of like whispering and like like white noise and sort of like mouth sounds. It's sort of like stuff that's designed to be like soothing, you know?
Yeah, it stands for Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response. and it's designed to some people are like really turned on by it, for a lack of a better word, and there's like whole YouTube channels devoted to it and stuff.
And I'm not historically, but this brought like the type of feeling that people talk about, sort of like a calmness or a heightened sensory awareness, because I felt like I was on a train, which is an experience I like. You know what I mean? It's to me, a train's very calming in some ways, and just that this album, like I'll have to redo my research, but this album has to be built around the idea of a soundscape that sounds like a train, because the whole time it sounded like the wheels of the train and the whooshing outside. Like it was the concept set sonically. I feel like
yeah, you were like really entranced by this album. It sounds like
I was. It was a really interesting, and it wasn't just a one-time listening experience either. It was each time I listened to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think both Matt and I said that we recognize like how foundational and influential, and we can see that, but I did not like have that sort of experience, you know, emotionally or any sort of connection. It's almost like, in some respects, I feel like this album has like gone full circle, and it's almost like a little kitschy in a way, or like people would make fun of this type of album, or like if they did an imitation of electronic music, this is what they'd do. They'd be like Sprockets, right? That's what I have as my background on YouTube. It would be like if you went up to a person on the street and said, describe electronic music, they would like make electronic sounds and like walk like a robot. And I feel like that's what this is in some respects. And I'm not saying that that's right or that's how I feel about it, but people aren't going to, well, I don't respond to it in that way. Like, this is like mind-blowing. I can totally see it, but it just doesn't connect with me in that way.
Yeah, and I just think that I would need and I think you're right, John. I think that's a good way of putting it. The melody, you know, how they do the melody, because there is melody in here. It's not an unpleasing sound, you know.
No,
what I mean?
I agree.
It's not.
Yeah.
You know, there's certain parts of the other of.
It's not abrasive at all.
Yeah, there are certain parts of Can that I was like, that's not a very pleasant thing. Like, you know, some of the noise and some of the stuff, the experimentation was not pleasing. This is pretty much pleasing throughout the whole thing, but it's just it just. And I don't know. It was like an LCD sound system thing, which is like the ideas are there and I like it, but as the music goes on, it doesn't. I get bored with it, I guess.
Can I just go on the record and say I love this album way more than anything like a band like LCD Sound System did. I think it's way more. It just in the period it was released in, and sort of like. Yes, LCD Sound System is certainly a person that took, but I think the electronic music that LCD Sound System's coming from is like club electronic music, which to me is an entirely different. The only thing it shares in common is that it's electronic, you know.
Well, but the reason that I bring it up is because it's I have that experience, and I was thinking of them when I listened to this, because that's very similarly. There's parts of that where I'm like, ooh, that's cool, I like that, and then like as it goes on, I get less interested in it as it continues. To an extent, and I feel like I walk away from this going, I feel like I should like this more than I do. You know what I mean? Because I do like it, but it's not like it doesn't take me to the next level. I'm like, oh my god, you know, like, and I feel like I would like to get there, and I just don't. And I know people love Craftwork, and I know they love the LCD Sound System, and it's like these huge, highly regarded, you know, bands and stuff. And I get to a level, and it just plateaus, you know, and it kind of just stays there. And that's kind of how I feel about this. It's like I said, it's not unpleasing. I get why it does put you in a trance a little bit and get you. I could see certain parts of the night, like in, you know, this is a nice thing to listen to, and the influence is ridiculous, you know, what they and how innovative it was. But yeah, it stays there. The plateau, I guess, is the way that I go with it. You know, I want something to like really crescendo and build and stuff, and it doesn't do that, you know. And so because of that, it's going to lose me if you're going to do that for 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes. So that's kind of how I fall flat a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not one of those. I was just thinking about as a whole. I'm not one of those people that likes long, like droning, repetitive, like hypnotic, even in like other areas of life, like if you did yoga or like some sort of like meditation or something. I don't think I could ever like get into that state, and maybe you just got into that state more than we did, John.
Well, and I think you guys know I do stuff like that, so
Yeah.
I can get into that state if need be. But yeah, I get it. I totally get how it's not for everybody. But I at least wanted to put forward that there absolutely is a crowd of people who this not only is going to be for, but I think that's going to be like the gem of what we've talked about if they go back and listen to it. And I think that's probably why you need to listen to this, because I think you really are going to fall in one of two. You're either going to hear it like Matt and Josh did, or you're going to hear it like I did. And I don't know how you could be like neutral on this, because it's not really designed to be neutral, you know? And, yeah, all I can think about is like, you know, the Joy Division, Depeche Mode, but also like Gary Newman, right, who's after this a little bit, and just different people like that. You know, all the stuff like, you know, we said Flock of Seagulls and all the one-hit wonders of the 80s, right, all over this. And yeah, and then this branches off into like so many different subcategories that eventually become what's known as electronic music. And that's why, you know, and that's why, you know, when something becomes omnipresent, it can become like a farce too, right? But like this is at the ground floor, where even if you hear it as a farce 10 years later, like you just have to think about the landscape this album came into, where there was no template for this. So, you know, I don't think anybody could hear this as a farce at the time, because it's like, what is this sonic palette that I've never heard before? I think that's how I experienced this. And that's why I like listening to these albums in their time, and why I really have been trying to ground some of my takes